February 28, 1942. The humid night air over the Sunda Strait hung thick with smoke drifting from burning oil tanks on Java's coast. The remnants of the Allied fleet were scattered or sunk. The Japanese advance was relentless. For the exhausted crews of USS Houston and HMAS Perth, tonight was their final chance to escape encirclement. Both ships limped toward the strait with decks scarred from the Battle of the Java Sea, ammunition running dangerously low, and crews who had barely slept in days. But retreat was not surrender, not for these men. Captain Albert Rooks of Houston scanned the darkness from the bridge, knowing full well that they were sailing into waters the Japanese likely controlled. But radio silence was vital. Every creak of steel and every vibration of the engines felt amplified in the still night. Perth, under Captain Hector Waller, signaled quietly, proceeding through the strait. They had no choice but to trust their instincts. What they didn't know was that the Japanese were far from unprepared. Just before midnight, a massive invasion force, more than 50 troop transports, escorted by destroyers and patrol craft, began entering the strait as part of the plan to seize Western Java. Searchlights probed the water. Engines hummed. The sea itself trembled from the movement of hulls. And somewhere beneath that steel forest, a deadly presence lurked, Japanese submarine I-58, running silent, waiting in the deep, its periscope just brushing the starlit surface. Inside I-58, the tension was suffocating. The torpedo crew whispered mechanics checks, their hands steady despite the humid sweat sliding down their faces. Commander Yahachi Tanabe studied the dark horizon, unaware that the silhouettes approaching were not Dutch merchant ships, but two of the last major Allied warships still afloat in the region. Houston and Perth slipped closer, unaware they were gliding directly into a layered trap, destroyers above, troop transports ahead, and a submarine hunting beneath. The faint metallic echoes from the depths brushed along Houston's sonar, just soft enough to raise suspicion but not certainty. The men on deck felt it, that eerie stillness before history turns violent. The moon briefly pierced the clouds, illuminating shapes on the horizon. Not empty sea. Ships. Hundreds of them. And then a chilling realization spread through both bridges. They had sailed straight into the heart of a Japanese invasion fleet. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was the thin, silver trail of a periscope drawing a quiet line toward their future. The submarine was already locking in its first firing solution. And the ambush was seconds away from beginning. The first shape that emerged from the darkness seemed harmless, a lone cargo silhouette drifting across the narrow waterway. But as Houston and Perth closed the distance, the silhouettes multiplied. Dozens. Then scores. The black horizon was layered with shadows upon shadows, each one too large, too still, too perfectly spaced to be random. It wasn't a merchant route. It was an armada. Searchlights burst to life without warning, stabbing white beams that sliced across the ink-black sea. The cruisers' gray hulls glowed under the glare, instantly revealing themselves. Alarms wailed across Perth's deck, and Houston matched them seconds later. Officers scrambled, gunners manned their stations, and exhausted sailors braced themselves behind steel plating. Captain Rooks muttered under his breath, "My God, it's the landing force." He was right. The Allied cruisers had sailed into the full Japanese invasion convoy for Java. More than 50 troop transports. Multiple destroyers. Patrol craft. Minesweepers. Supply ships. All packed tightly together in the strait like a steel maze. Perth's Captain Waller hesitated for only a heartbeat. Then came the order that sealed their fate. Engage. Fight our way through. Houston echoed the command, though the crew already knew their ammunition was dangerously low. Some gun mounts had less than a dozen shells remaining. Others were running on half-crews, men shifting between stations as best they could. Still, they would fight. The cruisers surged forward, engines straining as they cut straight into the convoy's flank. Japanese destroyers panicked, firing starshells that turned the whole night into a ghostly battlefield. Columns of troops on transport decks shouted and scattered, many believing they were under air attack. Machine guns rattled. Tracers streaked across the water. The thunder of cannons rolled through the strait like a storm tearing itself apart. But none of the chaos mattered to the silent hunter below. Inside submarine I-58, red lamps cast long shadows across sweating faces. A hydrophone operator whispered urgently. Two large warships, closing fast, bearing 317. Commander Tanabe leaned close to the periscope, and there, illuminated by the frantic Japanese searchlights, he saw them. Two Allied cruisers charging directly into the convoy. This was no chance encounter. This was an opportunity the Imperial Navy could not ignore. "Prepare tubes 1 through 4, Tanabe ordered. The metallic clack of torpedo doors sliding open echoed through the hull. The water outside hummed with nearby propellers, dozens of ships, all moving in different directions. A torpedo fired into such chaos risked hitting Japanese vessels. But Tanabe didn't blink. "Stand by, stand by." Above, Houston's first salvo roared to life, tearing into a transport ship and erupting it into a tower of flame. Below, I-58 steadied its aim. The crosshairs drifted over Houston's hull. Tanabe whispered the final command. "Fire." And in the darkness, 4 torpedoes slid into the black water, racing toward the unsuspecting Allied cruisers. The first torpedo cut through the water like a silver blade, leaving a thin whispering trail behind it. The next 3 followed in silent formation, their engines humming beneath the waves, a sound no one on the surface could hear over the thunder of naval combat. Above, Houston and Perth were too busy fighting for their lives to notice anything below. Perth's forward 6-inch guns roared relentlessly, firing at silhouettes darting through the searchlight glare. Houston returned fire with her port batteries, blasting a Japanese destroyer attempting a flank run. The night sky flashed with explosions, the sea boiled with tracer fire. Then, high above the chaos, a lone Perth lookout spotted something strange, thin shimmering wakes cutting through the moonlit water, approaching fast. "Torpedoes," he shouted. The warning came seconds too late. The first torpedo streaked past Houston's bow by barely 20 yards, the wake foaming white. The second drifted beneath Perth without exploding, an inexplicable dud. The third and fourth found targets, but not the ones I-58 intended. A Japanese transport packed with soldiers erupted in a massive black and white fireball, its ammunition holds igniting instantly. Flames shot hundreds of feet upward. Burning debris rained across the water as men screamed and leapt into the sea. Moments later, a Japanese minesweeper took a direct hit and split nearly in half. Commander Tanabe grimaced inside I-58 as the submarine shook from secondary explosions above. He had missed the cruisers, but he had crippled his own convoy. On Houston's bridge, Captain Rooks seized the opportunity. "They're shooting at their own ships," one officer shouted. "No," Rooks said, voice steady. "There's a submarine under us." Perth's Captain Waller reached the same conclusion. With the convoy in chaos, ships tangled in panic, Japanese destroyers swerving violently to avoid their own transports, the Allied cruisers pushed forward at flank speed. Their wakes carved white lines through the burning debris fields. Machine gun fire rattled from troop transports firing wildly in every direction. But beneath the hulls, the Predator was not finished. Inside I-58, Tanabe slammed his fist against the plotting table. "Reload tubes. Quickly." Sweat-soaked torpedo crewmen heaved the heavy Type 95 torpedoes into position. The submarine tilted slightly as it changed depth, maneuvering for a second shot. The water outside glowed faintly from the burning ships above, casting ghostly ripples across the periscope lens. Tanabe steadied the crosshairs on the largest silhouette he could see, USS Houston. "Set angle, correct, steady." The sea trembled as another transport exploded overhead, raining shattered wood and burning fuel into the water. Tanabe exhaled slowly. "Fire." One torpedo launched, then another. 2 deadly streaks carved through the Black Sea aimed directly at Houston's portside. And this time, nothing stood between them and their target. The black water churned violently as the 2 torpedoes sliced toward Houston, their wakes glowing faintly under the moonlit haze. On the bridge, Captain Rooks heard the lookout's desperate cry. "Torpedoes portside. 2 of them." Rooks reacted instantly. "Hard to port. Full throttle." Houston heaved sharply, her engines roaring as she leaned into the turn. Men on deck grabbed rails as the cruiser groaned under the sudden strain. For a moment, it seemed the maneuver had worked. The first torpedo sped past the bow, its wake spraying foam as it shot into the darkness. But the second was perfectly angled. The torpedo struck Houston's port quarter with a thunderous metallic roar, an eruption of white water and shattered steel exploding upward like a geyser. The deck vibrated violently. Bulkheads buckled. The blast punched a jagged wound into the ship's side, flooding compartments almost instantly. Down below, engineers were thrown from their stations. Steam burst from ruptured pipes. Lights flickered and died. Flooding in engine room 2, a voice shouted. Watertight doors jammed, another cried. Men waded through rising water, hauling wounded sailors toward ladder wells. The air was thick with smoke and burning fuel oil. The ship listed to port by nearly 5 degrees, subtle at first, then frighteningly real. Perth, sailing nearby, saw the explosion and immediately veered to avoid collision. Houston's gunners, still reeling from the impact, forced themselves back to their stations as Japanese destroyers closed in. Machine guns peppered Houston's deck with tracer fire. Shell splinters rained across the superstructure. A Japanese destroyer launched another spread of torpedoes in the confusion, forcing Houston to adjust course despite her worsening condition. On the bridge, Captain Rooks steadied himself against a rail. Damage control, report. The reply came through static. Flooding cannot be contained, port engine lost, ship listing, but holding. Rooks closed his eyes for half a breath. Then. We continue fighting. Above the water, the chaos only grew. Burning transports drifted aimlessly. Japanese destroyers zigzagged to avoid friendly ships. Perth fired another broadside, striking a transport so hard its deck guns were ripped apart. But deep below, the true threat had not vanished. Inside submarine I-58, Commander Tanabe peered through the periscope again. The sea was a graveyard of flaming wreckage, sinking ships, and drifting lifeboats. And in the middle of it all, wounded but still moving, was USS Houston, trailing smoke, slowing, but refusing to die. Set depth, maintain bearing, Tanabe ordered. We fire again once she turns. The torpedo crew loaded another pair of Type 95s into the tubes. Tanabe studied the damaged cruiser one last time through the trembling lens. She survives, he whispered. Not for long. The submarine dipped deeper, engines humming like a predator circling for the kill. And beneath the burning strait, 2 more torpedoes prepared to rise toward Houston's broken hull. Perth surged forward through the burning corridor of the convoy, her bow cutting a white V-shaped wake through the smoke-choked night. Captain Hector Waller stood rigid on the bridge, illuminated by the red emergency lamps as he barked orders with absolute clarity. Target the destroyers, ignore the transports. The Australian cruiser shuddered as her forward 6-inch gun turrets opened fire, their muzzles flashing brilliant white against the darkness. The shells ripped across the water and smashed into a Japanese destroyer attempting to cut across Perth's path. The enemy ship's bow erupted in flame, and it veered sharply as sailors scrambled across the tilting deck. Perth had no time to celebrate. More Japanese ships were closing fast. A second destroyer charged from starboard, guns firing. Shells tore through Perth's superstructure, blowing open compartments and killing several crewmen instantly. Yet Perth fired again, one of her last salvos hitting the destroyer below the bridge and sending debris raining into the sea. A lookout shouted from above. Ammunition nearly gone. Turrets running dry. Waller didn't hesitate. Use whatever's left. We fight to the end. Perth's guns roared again, slower now, each shot fired with grim finality. The cruiser struck a transport ship loaded with troops. The explosion tore through its fuel stores, engulfing the deck in an inferno. Screams echoed across the water as lifeboats fell chaotically into the flames. But the Japanese escorts were not breaking. They were tightening the noose. For destroyers moved into formation around Perth, their silhouettes gliding out of the drifting smoke like predators encircling wounded prey. Floodlights snapped on, bathing Perth in unforgiving white light. Every dent, scorch mark, and torn plate of her hull was fully exposed. A radio operator turned to Waller, fear etched across his face. They're preparing torpedoes, sir. Waller nodded slowly. He already knew. Perth's engines growled as the cruiser attempted a desperate turn, trying to break free of the encirclement. But ammunition was nearly exhausted. Fuel reserves were dangerously low. The ship could not outrun or outmaneuver the coordinated destroyer attack. On the Japanese flagship, signal lamps blinked in rapid bursts. Destroyers aligned their torpedo tubes. 24 Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, the deadliest naval weapons in the world, were being primed for launch. On Perth's deck, sailors watched the destroyers fan out, their tubes swiveling in eerie synchronization. Some crossed themselves. Others gripped the rails with trembling hands. A few simply stared into the searchlight glow, knowing what came next. The sea fell silent for a moment, an unnatural calm that chilled every man aboard. Then, from the Japanese line, came the command. Torpedoes. Fire. And in the space of a heartbeat, white streaks surged into the water. A full broadside racing directly toward HMAS Perth. The first torpedo struck Perth with a thunderous impact that shook the entire ship from keel to mast. The explosion erupted into a towering plume of white water, smashing against the deck and hurling sailors off their feet. For a moment, it felt as if the entire cruiser had been lifted from the sea and slammed back down again. Then came the second hit. A blinding flash tore through the starboard side, ripping open the forward boiler room. Steam burst upward in a boiling cloud. Men screamed as superheated air filled the compartment. Others stumbled through the smoke, dragging wounded comrades toward whatever passageways were still accessible. Flooding in boiler room. Bulkheads failing, a voice shouted from below. The third torpedo arrived almost instantly after the second. A violent concussion rolled through the aft section, obliterating compartments and sending shockwaves along the length of the ship. Light fixtures shattered. Steel plates buckled. The deck twisted under the sheer force of the blast. On the bridge, Captain Waller steadied himself against the helm as the cruiser lurched violently to port. Perth began listing 5 degrees, then 8, then 10. Machinery roared below as engineers attempted to balance the flooding, but Perth was bleeding too quickly. Still, Waller refused surrender. Guns, fire at will, he ordered. Perth's surviving turrets spat flame again, their muzzle flashes illuminating the churning water. The cruiser struck another Japanese destroyer, ripping open its stern and sending flames bursting through its engine room. Even in her final moments, Perth drew blood. But the Japanese torpedo attack wasn't finished. A destroyer off Perth's starboard beam accelerated, weaving through debris and drifting wreckage, lining up for another shot. Its torpedo tubes swiveled with mechanical precision. The Japanese crew worked with cold, ruthless efficiency, no shouting, no chaos, just the methodical preparation of another kill. Below deck, the flooding surged into new compartments. Sailors fought to close watertight doors that would not seal. Water rose in stairwells. Oil slicks coated the floors as men slipped while dragging the injured. A few prayed. Others gripped valves with burning hands, trying to buy the ship's icons she no longer had. Perth's engines groaned as she slowed to a crawl. Smoke poured from shattered vents. The list deepened to nearly 15 degrees. Ammunition hoists jammed. Turrets fell silent one by one as their power cut out. On deck, the night was lit by burning transports, exploding ammunition, drifting flares, and the dying glow of Perth's final salvos. The sea around her hissed and churned from exploding shells and burning oil. Captain Waller watched the Japanese destroyer maneuver into position. He knew exactly what was coming. And then he heard it. The unmistakable sound of torpedo tubes being fired. A final spread, deadly, precise, impossible to outrun. Dozens of white wakes appeared from the darkness, racing directly toward the sinking Perth. The second torpedo spread struck Perth like a hammer against fragile glass. The first hit detonated just below the aft turret, ripping through the magazine spaces and sending a geyser of flame, water, and twisted metal roaring upward. The turret's armored roof lifted momentarily, a grotesque heartbeat, before crashing back onto the deck with a shudder that reverberated through the entire ship. The second torpedo struck moments later, tearing open compartments already weakened by flooding. Water surged inside with unstoppable force. Bulkheads groaned, bent, then cracked under pressure. The lights flickered, then died completely. For several seconds, Perth sailed in total darkness except for the glow of distant fires across the strait. A third torpedo slammed into the bow. The ship lurched violently. Men clung to railings as the deck tilted further left. On the bridge, Captain Waller saw the inclinometer needle slide past 20 degrees and keep going. There was no recovering from this. He inhaled once, steady and calm, then issued the order no commanding officer ever wishes to give. Abandon ship. Across Perth's steel corridors, the call echoed. Abandon ship. Abandon ship. Sailors stumbled through smoke-filled passageways, helping wounded comrades to the open decks. Some found the ladders flooded. Others forced open hatches that jammed from warped metal. The sea outside burned with floating fuel as men jumped overboard, hitting the water with hard splashes that sent ripples across the oil slicks. Japanese destroyers did not cease fire. Machine gun bursts peppered the water. Star shells burst overhead, lighting the horror with ghostly brilliance. Perth's list grew worse, 25 degrees, then 30. Water poured across the deck as the cruiser's port side dipped beneath the surface. Captain Waller remained on the bridge until it became impossible to stand. Officers tried to pull him toward the lifeline, but he shook his head, choosing to stay with his ship and his men. The sea poured through shattered windows as the bow began to sink. Finally, with a grinding metallic scream, Perth rolled further onto her side. Her stern rose into the night, propellers briefly illuminated by flame and searchlights. Moments later, the ship slipped beneath the waves in a violent rush of bubbles and debris. Hundreds of survivors clung to wreckage, coughing through oil and smoke, watching helplessly as the cruiser vanished into the black depths of the Sunda Strait. And through the drifting haze of fire and destruction, something else became visible. A lone silhouette. A single cruiser hull. USS Houston, still fighting, still burning, still advancing straight into the trap that had just consumed her sister ship. But beneath her, the hunter stirred once more. Submarine I-58 had already turned. Its torpedo tubes were being loaded again, this time for Houston. The sea still boiled with flames from Perth's sinking when Houston steamed forward into the strait, her silhouette ghost-like under drifting smoke. Every man aboard had witnessed the Australian cruiser's final moments, but there was no time to mourn. Japanese searchlights snapped back onto Houston as destroyers regrouped, fanning out like wolves circling a wounded bull. Captain Albert Rooks stood rigid on the bridge, the glow of fires reflecting off his face. "Gunnery officer," he called, "what ammunition remains?" The answer came with painful honesty. Main battery, less than 30 shells. Secondary guns, running dry. Machine gun belts nearly expended. Rooks didn't blink. "Then we make every shot count." Houston's forward turret roared, one of the last shells slamming into the side of a troop transport. A fireball blossomed across the ship's deck as hundreds of Japanese soldiers scrambled in panic. Another shot struck a destroyer's bow, twisting metal and sending sailors diving for cover. But every blast came at a cost. Houston was slowing, drifting dangerously as water flooded into her portside compartments. Damage control teams struggled to contain the flooding, but hoses burst, pumps jammed, and compartments filled faster than they could be sealed. Men waded waist-deep through water blackened with oil, hauling shoring planks and wounded sailors through choking smoke. On deck, the nightmare cut closer. A Japanese destroyer raced along Houston's starboard, guns firing at point-blank range. Shells tore across the deck, shredding railings and smashing equipment. Several sailors were cut down instantly. Houston's own gunners returned fire with a desperate burst, scoring a hit that set the destroyer's aft deck ablaze. But more enemy ships surged in. One destroyer launched star shells that burst overhead, turning night into a cold, white daylight. The scene became painfully clear: Houston was alone. Perth was gone. All escape routes were blocked. And the convoy stretched endlessly on both sides, with destroyers reorganizing for a coordinated torpedo strike. Still, Houston pressed forward. "Keep firing!" Rooks shouted. "We do not stop." Yet the ship trembled with every turn. Her engines coughed and sputtered. Her list deepened. Her speed dropped below 15 knots. Far below, the true danger moved silently. Submarine I-58 had repositioned behind the burning wreckage fields. Through the periscope, Commander Tanabe watched Houston struggle forward, a proud beast bleeding from a dozen wounds. He lifted his chin slightly, a gesture of respect, before signaling his torpedo crew. Prepare for final attack. Red lights flickered. Torpedo doors groaned open. Crewmen braced the long metal bodies into firing alignment. Tanabe murmured softly. She fought bravely. But now, the sea will take her. Above, Houston's searchlights flickered. Below, 2 torpedoes slid into the water. And this time, they were aimed directly at her heart. The last battle was seconds away. The first torpedo streaked past Houston's stern in a boiling white wake, missing by what felt like inches. The underwater hiss and snap echoed through the hull, but there was no time for relief. The second torpedo slammed into the cruiser's port side with a violent, deafening explosion that lifted the stern nearly out of the water. The blast tore open compartments already weakened from earlier hits. Steel plates buckled. A fireball rolled through the secondary engine room. Flooding cascaded into spaces that had barely been holding. The lights flickered once, and died for good. Port engine offline. Steering unresponsive. We're taking water fast. Damage control teams pushed into smoke-filled corridors, but the flooding was too severe. Pipes burst overhead. Doors jammed. Bulkheads creaked under the new pressure. Water surged in from everywhere at once, unstoppable, cold, and hungry. Houston slowed to a crawl. Japanese destroyers tightened their attack, sweeping in from both sides. Torpedo tubes rotated with eerie precision. Starshells burst overhead, turning the night into a pale, merciless illumination. The next wave of torpedoes launched, streaking across the water at terrifying speed. Captain Rooks steadied himself on the ruined bridge. How many rounds left? 6 shells, maybe 7. Then fire them. Houston's surviving turrets spat their final defiant blasts. One shell tore through a destroyer's forward gun mount. Another hit the superstructure of a transport packed with ammunition, sending a column of fire spiraling skyward. But the cruiser's guns fell silent one by one as power systems collapsed. A sudden blast of shrapnel tore across the bridge. Captain Rooks staggered, hit by fragments from a nearby explosion. He collapsed without a word. Officers rushed to him, but the reality was clear. The man who had led Houston through impossible circumstances would not leave his bridge alive. Below deck, the ship was dying. The list deepened 10 degrees. 15. 20. Water surged across the deck like a black tide. Sailors clung to rails, helping the wounded toward the starboard side. Abandon ship. The order echoed across the strait. Men leapt into the burning water, swallowed by darkness, smoke, and drifting oil. Some clung to debris. Others swam desperately toward the faint shapes of lifeboats. Japanese machine guns fired sporadically, cutting through the water with chilling whines. Houston rolled onto her port side. Her masts dipped into the sea. Her guns pointed uselessly into the sky. For a final moment, the cruiser hung there, broken but proud, before the sea consumed her. The stern rose, glistening under the glow of fires, then slipped beneath the waves with a roar of escaping air and collapsing steel. The last survivors watched helplessly as the ship vanished. But for those still in the water, the nightmare was not over. The burning wreckage drifted on the current. Explosions still rattled the strait. Japanese vessels circled the survivors. And deep below, the submarine that had dealt the fatal blow began rising slowly. To confirm that Houston was truly gone. For a long moment after Houston's stern slipped beneath the waves, the Sunda Strait seemed to hold its breath. Flames drifted across the black surface, carried by the gentle, mocking swell of the tide. Hundreds of sailors, American and Australian, floated among debris, oil slicks, and the bodies of friends who had not survived the night. The water burned their eyes. Oil filled their lungs with every breath. Some clung to rafts. Others held onto shattered planks from the two lost cruisers. Above them, the silhouettes of Japanese destroyers moved like silent predators. Periodically, bursts of machine gun fire crackled across the surface as the escorts fired at anything that moved. Survivors dove beneath the oily water each time, lungs screaming, hearts pounding. By 3 a.m., the gunfire slowed. The Japanese ships shifted focus to rescuing their own survivors from transports destroyed by friendly submarine torpedoes. A strange, terrible silence drifted over the strait, broken only by groans, prayers, and the distant crackle of burning wreckage. As dawn crept over the horizon, the scale of the devastation became visible. Charred wood. Empty life jackets. Oil drifting like a dark fog. The sea looked more like a graveyard than a battlefield. Japanese barges and patrol craft finally approached the Allied survivors, not to rescue them, but to capture them. Exhausted, shivering, many barely conscious, the men were pulled aboard and taken first to Serang, then later distributed among various prison camps. For the survivors, the Battle of Sunda Strait was only the beginning of their suffering. Many were sent to Burma and Thailand, forced to work on the Burma-Thailand Death Railway, where disease, starvation, and torture claimed countless lives. Others were transported to harsh labor camps across Japanese-occupied Asia. Out of the more than 1,100 men on Houston and Perth, only a few hundred survived the war. Yet in captivity, something remarkable happened. Even the Japanese guards spoke of the battle with grim respect. They had watched two outnumbered cruisers sail straight into a force of more than 50 ships, firing until their last shells, refusing to surrender, and inflicting heavy losses despite impossible odds. In the years after the war, survivors remembered the night not only for its horror but for its extraordinary courage. They remembered Captain Waller, refusing to abandon Perth. They remembered Captain Rooks, dying on his bridge while fighting for every man under his command. They remembered the roar of the guns, the burning sea, the last flashes of defiance as two Allied cruisers stood against an overwhelming force. And historians would later note something else. The fierce resistance of Houston and Perth disrupted the Japanese timetable, delayed landings, and forced convoy escorts to expend ammunition, fuel, and manpower far beyond expectations. The battle had been a slaughter. But it had also been a stand that shook the Imperial Navy's confidence. As survivors were marched into captivity on shore, one American sailor looked back at the strait, still burning, still echoing with the memories of the night. He whispered, "They may have sunk the ships, but they didn't break us." The screen fades to black, leaving the final sound, the quiet, eternal roll of the Sunda Strait.